Hello there and welcome. In this episode, we're going to focus on your requests. So from time to time, I'm going to pick random requests from the viewers and show you how to do them in a special episode. So the first request we got today is how to grow back trees that were cut down. Regrowing trees is pretty simple, especially now that we have the time manager. For this, we're going to open our resources folder, and inside we have our chopped tree prefab. This is what is getting instantiated when we chop down the tree. So inside of this prefab, we're going to select the parent object and we're going to add a script on it. We're going to name the script something like Regrow tree. For now, the only thing that we're going to have here is an integer of the day of regrowth. Next, we want to actually set the day of regrowth when this tree is chopped down. So inside the choppable tree script, we're going to find the tree is dead method. And over here, after we instantiate the chopped tree prefab, we are going to reach the regrow script and we're going to set the regrowth day. And the day of regrowth will be the current day, which is the day that we chopped the tree, and we're going to add 2 more days, so after 2 days, the tree will regrow. Now, of course, you can create this as some kind of variable that you can set from the inspector, and this way you can control the amount of days it's required for the tree to grow. So for now, it's just going to be 2 days, so we can test it faster. Now back inside the regrowth tree script, we're going to add a boolean that will basically be some kind of lock because we don't want to keep regrowing the tree after we reach this day. And inside the update method, we're going to check if the day of regrowth is our current day, then we want to regrow the tree. So if the day in game is equals to the day of regrowth and also the growth lock is false, we're going to set the lock to be true, so it will only happen once, and then we're going to run this method that is going to regrow our tree and basically instantiate a new tree prefab. So inside this method, we first set this entire object to be false because when we're going to instantiate the new prefab, we don't want it to collide with this old stump, but we still need a reference to this object. Then we're going to instantiate a new tree, and this is just the name that we have inside of our resources folder for the entire tree. So it's called tree parent, and this is what we're going to instantiate. Then we're going to provide it with the position. So this is the position of this current tree stump because this is where we want to instantiate the new tree. And you may have to play a bit with the positions. Maybe you will have to add some kind of offset to the Y, bring it up a bit, down a bit. It really depends on your model, but we're going to test this out. Next, we want to set the new tree to be a child of our trees object. So we have our environment object, and inside we have this object that keeps all the trees inside. So to be organized, we want to instantiate it to be a child of this object and not just somewhere in the root of the scene. And then of course we want to destroy this old stump. Now let's see why we have this problem. Right, because the name of this entire class is the same as this method, so we need to change it. So let's name it regrow new tree. Another thing that we want to do is remove the logs that we have inside this stump. Because inside the chopped tree, we have the stump, but we also have these logs. So if the player is not going to pick up these logs, but then 2 days will pass and the tree is going to get instantiated again, these logs are going to disappear. So we don't want this to happen. We want these logs to still lay around even if the player did not pick them up. So over here, we're going to move these logs to be a child of a different object so they will not get destroyed when we destroy this game object. So at the beginning, we're going to call a method named displaceLogs, and inside we're simply going to set these logs to be a child of another object. So we simply loop over all the children, and if one of these children is named log, then we're going to set the parent of the child to be the parent of this entire object. So if we find the log inside, this log will be a child of this entire tree's object. So we're going to chop down this tree. And now if we click on this chopped tree over here, we can see that the day of regrowth is the 4th day in game. And that's just because we chopped down this tree on the 2nd day. It was midnight on the 2nd day, so we added 2 more days, so it means day 4. So now we're going to wait until day in game number 4, and this will regrow our tree. So 1 more day and it should instantiate the tree. Of course, we can pick up these logs, we can keep them on the floor, it doesn't matter. So let's wait until midnight. Then it's going to destroy the stump and instantiate a new tree prefab. So we can see that it instantiated the tree. Of course, it instantiated a bit higher than expected, and that's why I told you that you need to play around with the values. But everything is working. We can basically chop this one down and still have more logs. So of course, you will probably use more than 2 days. You will probably let it wait for like a week until it regrows, or maybe not. It depends on you if you want the system. But over here inside the regrow new tree method, we're simply going to decrease the y by, let's say, 2 and see how it looks. So the new tree was instantiated. Of course, because it was instantiated and both of these things have a box collider, it pushed this log away, but it's not something you can't fix. You just need to disable the box collider maybe at this point of time. But we can see with -y, it was instantiated exactly on the floor. So again, you need to play around with the value because maybe you're going to have another model. So you need to make sure it gets instantiated properly. But we can see that everything is working. And now this is an entirely new tree. So if I chop this one, then the new tree will have to wait 2 days. And of course, every other tree in our game will have the same exact system. So that's how we regrow trees in our game. The next viewer request is how to drop items from our inventory back into the world. And that is something that is also doable, so let's see how we can do it. If we go into our drag drop script that is placed on all the items inside our inventory, and this basically gives them the option to be dragged and dropped, and we scroll down to the end drag method, over here we have this if statement that checks if the item was dragged into the root of the transform. So if it was not dragged into another slot, but it was just dragged into basically outside of the inventory, then we place it back into the starting position. So we can use this part of the code to instantiate and drop the item back into the world. Now, of course, like in most games, we want to first alert the player if he wants to do it, because maybe he's going to drag it by mistake and release, so maybe it was not his intention to do it. So we're going to create some kind of alert that will first ask the player if this was his intention. Now inside our canvas, we have this deletion alert that we use in order to alert the player if he wants to trash the item. So we can definitely use this one, but we don't want to use it in the same way because we do want to get the answer of the player before we decide what we do with the item. So let's just hide this for a second. And over here, we're going to create a new object and we're going to name it Alert Dialog Manager. And inside we're going to have the same script. Inside of this manager, we're going to have reference to all the UI components of this message. So we're going to have a reference to the box itself, to the message, and to the OK and cancel buttons, because we want to run some kind of code when the player decides to click on OK or cancel. And because we want to make it generic, we also want to be able to change the text using the code and not just hard code some kind of text. Because right now we're using it for dropping the item, but you can use this entire alert manager for other things and not only for dropping the item. So first we're going to have these references. Next, we're going to create a callback. And a callback is something that is very common in software development. It's not something we covered in this series, but that's just because we never actually needed it. I'm going to try to explain to you this concept, although it can be a bit confusing, especially if you're a beginner that is just following this series and you don't have prior knowledge in software development. A callback is basically just a way to get a response from the player that we don't know when this response is going to happen. We can basically say when the player clicks on one of these buttons, get the response from the player and run some kind of code based on this response. And we can definitely do it in a different way, but it's not going to be an efficient and good way code-wise, because we can simply show this alert and then create some kind of on-click listener for both of these buttons and then wait for the player to click on these buttons. But let's say we have a reference to the item that we want to drop. Maybe when the player is going to click on these buttons, we're going to lose the reference to this item. So with this callback, we're not losing anything because we're just sending the callback and we're waiting for the response. So it's a closed circuit, and this is the correct way to show these alerts. So first we're going to create the actual callback. And callbacks can receive parameters, so this will be the type of response from the player. We simply need to know if the player has clicked on the OK button or the cancel button, right? So we can use a boolean. So if he's going to click on the OK button, we're going to send true. And if he's going to click on the cancel, we're going to send false. Of course, we can use other types of data. Next, we're going to add a few methods, and I'm going to explain to you what is going on inside of them. So inside the start method, first we want to make sure that the dialog box is not visible. Then we're going to add on-click listeners for the cancel button and the OK button. So far this is exactly the same way we do it usually, right? We add an on-click listener and then we say which method we want to run when the player is pressing on the button. This time we want to run this method that is named handle response. But we also want to provide it with an argument, and if he's going to click on the OK button, we're going to send true inside. But if he's going to click on the cancel button, we're going to send false. So this method is going to receive either true or false. And then, of course, after we click on one of these buttons, we want to hide the dialog box again, because over here we're displaying it, but then we want to hide it after the player actually clicked on one of these buttons, and we want to invoke the callback. So we basically want to get the response from the player and invoke the callback. This will make sense when we actually call this method inside the drag and drop script. And first, we're also going to display the entire dialog inside the drag drop script. We're going to set the message of this dialog. We're going to set the callback because it's going to receive our callback, and we're going to show the actual dialog box. So again, if it seems confusing, it's going to make sense when we actually call this method inside the drag drop script. Now inside the drag drop script, we're going to find this onDrag method again. And as I told you, this is where we want to actually run the code, because this is what is going to get triggered when we drag something into the root of our inventory and not on an actual slot. But before we run the code, we also want to store a reference to the item that is being dragged, because over here we're going to nullify this item, but before that we want to still use this item as a reference. So we're simply going to have a temporary reference for this item. Now inside this part, which is the main part that is going to run when we drop an item outside of the inventory, first of all, we want to hide the actual inventory item, so the icon itself should not be visible at this point. Then we want to get a reference to the dialog manager itself. So we're getting a reference to the dialog manager, and we can do this by using the find object of type. So it will simply look through our entire scene and get this object, and we only have one of these objects, so it's going to get the reference and store it over here, and then we can access the dialog manager. So we're going to access the dialog manager, and we want to run this show dialog method, right? I think it's private, so let's go over here. Yes, it's private. Let's make it public. So show dialog, and now, like every other method, we simply need to provide it with the parameters. So we can see that it requires a string for the message. So the message will be something like, do you want to drop this item, right? But there's another parameter, and the parameter is this callback, right? We need to send a callback inside of this method, inside of the dialog manager, and then we're simply going to get the response from the onClick, right? We don't want to create the onClick here inside the drag drop script because it's simply not going to work. So we're going to provide it with the actual callback. So we do this with this syntax. We're providing it with the callback, and then we're going to say what is going to happen when we get the response. So inside these curly brackets, we're going to say if and else, and now we need to give a name to the response. So the name of the response is basically the parameter that we send inside the callback, which is a boolean, this boolean and this response, right? The response is a boolean and it gets into this callback, and this callback is storing the response. So over here, we're going to get this response. Now, it doesn't really matter what you name it. It can be anything. It can be X, it can be Mike, it can be response. It doesn't really matter as long as you give it some kind of name, and we're going to name it response because it's going to be much more understandable. So this is the response we're going to get from the callback. And now we simply say if the response is true, right? If it's true, then run this code. Else, run this code. So this way we can wait for the click of the player on one of these buttons and run some kind of code, and all of this will happen inside of the drag drop script without actually creating on-click listeners inside the drag and drop script, and this will anyway not work because we cannot have a reference to these clicks on this drag drop, because this drag drop script sits on our inventory items and not on the actual UI. So over here, if the response is true, it means that the player clicked on OK, right? So he agreed to drop the item. So let's call a method drop item into the world. And the item that we want to drop is this temporary item. I have a typo over here, temp item reference. And we're going to generate this method. But if he's going to click on cancel, then we're simply going to run this code that we usually run when the player drags an item into something that is not a slot, right? And of course, we also want to show the icon again when this happens. So now before we deal with this drop item into the world, and here we're going to basically just instantiate a prefab based on the name of this item. So if we picked up a rock or a stone and we want to drag it back into the world, we're simply going to instantiate a stone in front of the player and it's going to get dropped back into the world. It's very simple. But first we need to have a reference inside the dialog manager to all of these UI components. So now back in the UI, we don't want to use this deletion alert because each of these buttons has an on-click listener inside the code, and if we're going to use this, it's just going to mess up the entire way the game is working. So instead of this, we're simply going to duplicate this entire UI and make it dedicated for the dropping of the item. So we simply select this and click on Ctrl D. So we're going to duplicate this. Let's place it next to this one. We're going to hide this one as it was, and we're going to rename this to drop alert UI. And we can keep these the way they are, the tags, the yes and the no, but we need to add them as a reference into the alert manager. So the entire deletion alert will go over here into the dialog box. Well, not the deletion, the drop alert, right? Then the text will go into the text, yes will go into OK, and no will go into cancel. And of course, we can set it to be invisible at the start of the game. Next, we want to be able to spawn this item that we're dropping into the world. And of course, we can simply spawn it at the position of the player. But if we're going to spawn it at the position of the player, the item will simply drop on the floor under the player. We want to create some kind of feeling like the item is actually being dropped in front of the player. So for this, we're going to create another item that is going to hold this object when we instantiate it. So we're going to create a new object. We're going to make it into a cube just so we can see where it is. And we're going to drag it in front of the player so you can also see it inside the actual view of the game. And let's say somewhere around here. And now we're going to rename it to be drop spawn. We're going to remove the mesh renderer and also the box collider. We can also remove the entire component because we don't need these things. We just wanted to see the position of this object. And now you can play around with the position, but we already found that this is the position in front of the player. So we're going to instantiate the item into this position. Now, of course, it's not going to be a child of this spawn. It's just going to be instantiated at the position of the spawn. Now back inside the drag drop script, we're going to complete this drop item into the world method, and it's going to be a bit long, but all we're doing here is getting the name of the item that we want to drop. We instantiate the actual prefab, we set the position to be the position of the drop spawn, and then we also delete the item from the inventory because if we dropped it into the world, we don't have it anymore inside the inventory. So again, as I told you, we first get the clean name. So if this was a stone clone, then we simply cut out the clone part and we get stone. Then we instantiate the item, so it will be stone underscore model. Of course, it's very important that you have this object inside your resources folder. Because at the moment, we don't have the stone inside the resources folder. Our stones are inside the prefabs folder because we never instantiated them. We manually placed them into the world and we never actually instantiated them. So they were always inside the prefabs folder. So we need to make sure that we also have a stone model inside the resources. So let's just take the stone and we can also duplicate it. And let's rename it to be stone model. And then we cut it and drag it into the resources folder. So now that we have it inside the resources folder, it's going to instantiate the stone. And we need to do it with all the other items that we can pick up and throw back into the world. So the stick and all the other things. Of course, it's not a good idea that you also have a copy of the stone over here and also a copy over here, because if someday you're going to change something in the code or in the way the stone is working, then you also need to do it in the resources folder. So you can just move all of these things into the resources folder and have them as the model itself. So make sure that you have a specific naming convention. Stone and then model, the clean name and then model. Then we're going to set the item to the position of the drop spawn, and we get the drop spawn position by reaching into the player body, and we have a reference inside the player state singleton. Then we get the drop spawn position, and then we simply set the item's position to be equals the drop spawn position. Then we also want to set all of these items back into the items object, right? Because when we drop the rock back into the world, we don't want it to just be a child of the root. We want it to be a child of this items object. Of course, you can add more code to find one of these categories and then set all the stones back into the stones category. But the important thing is that it's going to be a child of this items object. Then we also want to destroy the stone from the inventory. So for this, we destroy the actual inventory item, but we also recalculate the entire inventory system to remove it from all these lists that we have. So now let's see that it's actually working. Let's also go back into the drop spawn and maybe make it a bit higher and maybe a bit more forward so we can actually see the stone dropped in front of our eyes. So now we're going to pick up this stone. We can see it inside the inventory, and now if I'm going to drag it to another slot, it will simply go into the slot. But if I'm going to drag it anywhere outside the slot, so either over here or into the root, it's going to ask me if I want to drop this item. Now we need to adjust the UI, but that's not important. If I click on cancel, it will simply bring it back into the inventory. But if I click on OK, we can see that the item was dropped in front of our eyes and we don't have this inside the inventory. And now it's inside the items of the world and we can pick it up again, throw it back. So this is how we drop items into the world. And these are the two viewer requests that we covered today. In the future, I'm going to do more of these episodes. They're going to be random, so in the next episode, we're going to continue working on different systems, but somewhere in the future, I'm going to have more of these viewer requests episodes. So make sure to ask something that you want to see me doing, and maybe your request is the one that is going to be shown. So that's all for this episode. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe. Please leave a like. It will help me a lot with the algorithm. You can also leave a comment. It will also help me a lot. So I'll see you next time.